Welcome to the Dr. Warren Gage podcast, and we have come now to Job chapter 31, which is the culmination of his defense, the case that he would like to present to God. He has confessed that he doesn't have the wisdom. That was the theme of chapter 28. He doesn't have the wisdom to understand what has happened to him. And I think that'll be highlighted when we come to the first paragraph of chapter 31. He wants an answer. He refuses not to trust God, but he laments the fact that he's suffering so without understanding. And that's the heart of his dilemma. So we'll look at chapter 31. This is the culmination of his argument. He had argued in chapter 29. He'd looked back nostalgically on the days of his prosperity when he, as he said, had the favor of God over his tent. But then in the last chapter, in chapter 30, he had looked at the days of his adversity. And I used that language deliberately because Solomon says in Ecclesiastes, where he laments the condition of man, he said, God has created the day of prosperity and the day of adversity, and it's not given to man to understand why. So why is it that the unrighteous prosper, and why is it that the righteous suffer? And that understanding is not given, it's not revealed, and so it creates a lot of difficulties. It confounds our attempts to make an equation between living correctly and prospering. And that would certainly be the case if the blessing of God was based on human merit. But that's clearly not the case because no one deserves anything. We are all sinful creatures. And in God's good providence, he requires faith, the only thing that can please him. And faith often is, as Hebrews defines it, it is actually the belief in things that are unseen. And Job holds fast to his belief that God is just, but he cannot understand it. Those things are not revealed. When we come to the conclusion of the book, we'll see how God addresses that. But God requires us to walk in integrity like Job and in perseverance, whether it's in the day of prosperity or the day of adversity. And that's highlighted here and very consistent with Solomon's wisdom. So chapter 31, Job has an introductory strophe, the first 4 verses, where he states his principle of justice that he understands, and then he's going to take a series of oaths. We will see that the strophe beginning in verse 5 begins, "If I have walked with falsehood, or if my foot has hastened to deceit." And then in verse 8, "Then let me sow and another eat." He calls down an imprecation, a curse upon himself if he's done something amiss. So it's an if-then pattern. The same in verse 9. "If my heart has been enticed by a woman," he says that would be sin and would destroy, he says, verse 12. That would be a fire that consumes to destruction and would root out all my increase. So there's, again, an if-then pattern. We have verse 13, "If I've despised the cause of my male or female servant," then he would understand that he would have no answer before God in verse 14. "What then shall I do when God rises up?" So we see this if-then pattern. Verse 16, "If I've kept the poor from their desire." And then we come to verse 24, "If I've made gold my hope and said to find gold." And then verse 29, "If I've rejoiced in the destruction of him who hated me." And so we see all the way through there's this if-then pattern. Verse 38, and there are others, but he says, "If my land cries out against me, and its furrows weep together, if I've eaten the fruit without money, or caused its owners to lose their lives, then let thistles grow instead of wheat, and weeds instead of barley." So he's going to examine every aspect of his social relations to see if he can be justly accused of any crime. And the answer to that, as far as he knows, is then. So he's taking is no, and so he is taking oaths. These are all the if-then pattern. It's formally called prothesis and apodosis. Prothesis and prothesis and apodosis. The prothesis is, we don't have a Latin formulation for it, so it's just called an if-then clause in English, which is kind of a construct. But prothesis means the thenein is to put forward. If you put forth a thesis, if I have done this, then apodosis is from didomi, which is to give, then let me give back. So it's a consequence. It's a statement and then a consequence. If I've done this, then let this happen. He's taking a series of oaths. If I've done this wickedness that he will posit, then let me receive the just punishment from that. But he's examining all of his life and he's acquitting himself. He said, I've not done any of these things. And so he ends with this great oath. This is the climax of his self-defense before God. So let's look at the first stanza again. He says, if I've made a covenant with my eyes, that is, he's not going to let himself look to see something that would cause him to sin. And this anticipates the Lord's teaching that if you look after a woman to lust after her, you're guilty already of adultery in your heart. So it's a very high bar that he is setting. If I've made a covenant with my eyes, he says, why then should I look upon a young woman? For what is the allotment of God from above and the inheritance of the Almighty from on high? He calls the punishment of sin an allotment or an inheritance. That's what you deserve. That's what you will have. That's the portion that is allotted to you. And he says, is it not destruction for the wicked and disaster for the workers of iniquity? And that's precisely the condition he's in. He suffered massive destruction and disaster. And so that equation would mean that he is wicked and iniquitous. But that doesn't follow. He says, does he not see my ways and count all my steps? Can't God see that I haven't committed this kind of a crime? I made a covenant with my eyes. I would not look. I would not permit them to look upon that which might provoke the sin nature that is within me. So then now he begins his series of prothesis, apodosis clauses. If I've done this, then let this happen to me. And he says it would be justice if that were the case. If I have walked with falsehood, or if my foot has hastened to deceit, then let me be weighed on honest scales, that God may know my integrity. If my step is turned from the way, or my heart walked after my eyes, or if any spot adheres to my hands, then let me sow and another eat. And yes, and let my harvest be rooted out. So that's the curse that he's calling down upon himself. It's an imprecation. If I've done anything like that, then I would justly be deserved of sowing, and then another taking my labor from me, and let my harvest be rooted out. Everything that I would take, to let that be taken from me. So I would not be deserving of it. If my step has turned from the way, or my heart has walked after my eyes, or if any spot adheres to my hands, he's talking about everything, his feet, his eyes, and his hands, that causes us to be engaged in life. If he's gone to the wrong places, if he's seen the wrong things, or if he has done anything amiss with regard to this, then bring this curse down upon him. The next strophe, if my heart has been enticed by a woman, or if I have lurked at my neighbor's door, then let my wife grind for another, and let others bow down over her. So the if then comes quickly. He says, if my heart has been enticed by a woman, or if I've lurked at my neighbor's door, obviously to take his neighbor's wife, to covet, and then to take in adultery, so that would violate a number of the commandments. He says, if I've done that, then let my wife grind for another. That is, let her have a menial place. It's the one who had the honor of being married to Job. He said, let her have a menial place grinding at the mill for another man, and let others, plural, which is shocking, let others bow down over her. And he's talking about to take a sexual posture. In other words, let her be delivered over to other men to sleep with. He says, for that would be a wickedness, yes, it would be iniquity deserving of judgment. For that would be a fire that consumes to destruction and would root out all my increase. But he's had all of his increase rooted out, and there's been destruction in his house. So if he's innocent of this, then how is he to understand, to begin to comprehend all the disasters that have come upon him? The next strophe, verse 13, if I've despised the cause of my male or female servant when they complained against me, that is, if he played his status card because he was the richest man and had many servants. Actually, the word is slave, which should be better. In other words, there's a larger class distinction that seems apparent in that language. If he's a master and they're a slave, rather than a proprietor and a servant, the class difference is massive here. If he's despised the cause of his male or female slave when they complained against him, he's showing that he wouldn't do that. He wouldn't recognize that as having a purchase on him in time of justice. He would hear if a servant has a complaint or a slave has a complaint against him. He says, what then shall I do when God rises up if he despise such a cry from one of his servants? When he punishes, how shall I answer him? Did not he who made made me in the womb make them? I think it's a very wonderful sentiment to understand that wherever we are in life, and whoever it is that we see that might ordinarily be despised in our eyes, to remember that God made them in the womb just as he made us. Our beginnings were the same. God fashioned us and created us in our mother's wombs. And so he sees that very fundamental origin of humanity as giving a basis for justice for everyone. It's really quite remarkable, the sentiment here. Did the same one not fashion us in the womb? So he recognizes that there's nothing inherent in us that differentiates us with respect to justice. And that means that he should treat everyone with equality. He says male and female. So that too was a big distinction in the ancient world. And he makes no distinction at all when he's talking about the matters of justice. You can see that this is a tremendously good and just man. I think this is giving some flesh to that theory, I think it seems to me. Next strophe, if I've kept the poor from their desire or caused the eyes of the widow to fail. The poor has very little to defend himself with, and the same is true of the widow. She has no one to defend her. So if he resisted what they have asked for or despised them, caused the eye of the widow to fail because she has no one to advocate for her in the gate. Or if I've eaten any morsel by myself so that the fatherless, the orphan, could not eat of it. If he ate alone and ignored the hunger of the orphan, he says, but from my youth I reared him as a father. He said, if there was a fatherless person in his community, he would become their surrogate father. He said, from my youth I reared him as a father, and from my mother's womb I guided the widow. So he had compassion on the widow and the orphan, which James says is true religion. If I've seen anyone perish for a lack of clothing, or any poor man without covering, if his heart has not blessed me, and if he was not warmed with the fleece of my sheep, he provides clothing for those that are threatened with nakedness. Not only the shame of nakedness, but the cold that comes at night. He said his heart, the heart of the poor person, would bless him because whenever he would put on his cloak, he would remember that Job has given him that comfort, that human comfort, that warmth. He says, if I've raised my hand against the fatherless, the orphan, when I saw that I had help in the gate. Again, the orphan would have no one to advocate for him in the gate because it was an all-male culture. But Job would be the one who would advocate. So even in a culture like that, he could effect justice. He said, when I saw that he had no help, if I've done any of these things, and there are a series of ifs here in 16 and 19 and 21, he said, then the apodosis comes in verse 22. Then let my arm fall from my shoulder, and let my arm be torn from the socket. That is, let him be made completely ineffective and unable to act. That would be the just punishment for one who refused to act when there was a necessity that he could meet. He says, for destruction from God is a terror to me, and because of his magnificence I cannot endure. So he fears the destruction that has come from God, that would be justly deserving by someone who ignored the cry of the poor. But he has not done that. And because he's lived in the fear of a just God, he cannot understand how all this destruction has come upon him. The dilemma and the perplexity is quite clear. He says, if I've made gold my hope, or said to find gold, you are my confidence. It's so easy for us to have confidence in our wealth, because that gives us certain abilities with which we can protect ourselves and perpetuate our comfort. And so if that's the case, if we're not willing to renounce it all, then mammon, which is an idol, has crept into our thinking. And he's saying here that that's not been his case. He's not given his hope into his gold. And that's a dilemma, because the heart of man is an idol factory, as Calvin said. And so it's very easy for us to put our confidence in things that are not secure and shouldn't be. I remember reading a book by Jacques Ellul a long time ago when I was young. It was called Money and Power, and he was pointing out that he was making the case, and I don't buy it entirely, but it really did help me to see. He was making the case that we shouldn't have insurance. Christian folk, why should we have insurance? Isn't our insurance God? And he made the case that we shouldn't have savings for retirement. To whom are we looking to take care of us in our aged years and in the years of our infirmity? So it was a radical statement which really helped me. I think he actually believed it. He's a tremendous thinker and Christian philosopher, French Protestant, and went through World War I and II, I believe. But in any case, and he'd seen the destruction of everything, certainly in World War II. But and a strong Christian voice. He wrote for Le Monde, which is kind of amazing back in the day. But anyway, that radical statement made me realize that ultimately the fight is to have, if God gives us some means and some property, then the temptation is to trust in those means and not in God himself. So that was useful for me, I think. Anyway, he says, if I've made gold my hope, or said to find gold, you are my confidence. If I've rejoiced because my wealth was great, and because my hand had gained much, if I have observed the sun when it shines, or the moon moving in brightness. That is, he's speaking here of explicit idolatry. Implicit idolatry, I think, would be gold and the confidence that we would have in our property, but explicit would be worshiping the sun or the moon. These are almost universal idols in the world outside of the reach of Christianity. If I observe the sun when it shines, or the moon moving in brightness, so that my heart has been secretly enticed and my mouth has kissed my hand, that is in reverence to, you kiss your hand in reverence to the sun, which is an act of worship, he said, then also, this would also be iniquity deserving of judgment, for I would have denied God who is above. So he recognizes the subtlety of idolatry. I'm not so sure that we're mindful of that. None of us that I know of, hopefully, but none of us bow down to images of gold and silver idol representatives like in the ancient world, but gold and silver can be an idol into the human heart when it's not in the form of some kind of image, if we put our confidence and our trust in that finally. And I think that's his point. If I have rejoiced in the destruction of him who hated me, or lifted myself up when evil found him. And I think it's a natural proclivity of the human heart. If someone hurts you, to expect, actually, because if there's cosmic justice, they should run into difficulty. And when they do, to rejoice in that, and not to have our compassion that should be general provoked because there is a particular injury here. And I think all of us have been in that condition. He says, if I have rejoiced in the destruction of him who hated me, and that seems almost natural, or lifted myself up when evil found him. Indeed, I have not allowed my mouth to sin by asking for a curse on his soul. For someone who injured him, he refused to curse. The temptation is to curse, but Christ is the one who blessed those who cursed him. So the calling is to be consistent in calling down blessings on everyone, friend and foe alike. So if the men of my tent have not said, who is there that has not been satisfied with his meat? That is, everyone knew that they had a place at the table of Job. Those that were in his tent and those that were in his community, if they were hungry, they would have a place there. He said, but no sojourner had to lodge in the street. A sojourner, you can see the word jour, the French word day. It's someone who is living with us today, but tomorrow may move on. So a sojourner had to lodge in the street. He didn't do that. He would invite everyone under the shelter of his tent. He says, for I have opened my doors to the traveler. If I have covered my transgressions as Adam, by hiding my iniquity in my bosom, as Adam hid from God, he clearly has an awareness of the Bible. How much of that, we don't know. We don't know when this book is dated, but he certainly has the tradition, the oral tradition, at least, of Genesis. Whether he has that understanding directly from Moses is unknown, because these stories in early Genesis are known all over the world. The creation, the flood, some way in which we've offended the gods that came, all of those are common to cultures widely dispersed throughout the earth after Babel. So there was an oral tradition, corrupted in many ways, but still in some ways recognizable, that had gone into all the earth. But he knew the name Adam. I think that's instructive. And that Adam had hidden his iniquity. He hid behind the fig leaves. He hid in the trees of the garden, away from God, by hiding my iniquity in my bosom, because I feared the great multitude and dreaded the contempt of families, so that I kept silence and did not go out of the door. He didn't do that. Oh, that I had one to hear me. Again, he goes back to this longing he's had throughout for a mediator, someone, some advocate, someone to come alongside of him and advocate for him, a paraclete. Oh, that I had one to hear me. Here is my mark. So he's signing his testimony. He's authenticating it with the mark of his own hand. Here is my mark. Oh, that the Almighty would answer me, that my prosecutor had written a book. The one he knows the Almighty is the one who's prosecuting him, apportioning to him the punishment of the wicked. And so he wants to know why. And he's examined all of these aspects of his life. He finds himself to be blameless. And so he makes that case. He agrees with what justice would come against wickedness if there were violation in any of these areas, but he pronounces himself innocent and makes his claim and longs for a mediator, for an advocate who would defend him. He says, surely I would carry it on my shoulder if the prosecutor wrote out his indictment, and he knew that it was true. He said, surely I would carry it on my shoulder and bind it on me like a crown. He would not resist the punishment that would justly be portioned to him. He said, I would declare to him the number of my steps. Like a prince, I would approach him. He would be bold. There is nothing that he knows. He knows that God takes account of every step that he makes. He's already mentioned that. But when he examines the steps that he has taken, he can't find anything by which to fault himself. If my land cries out against me, and it furrows, it takes this final protasis apodosis clause to say that he still affirms justice. And even if his land, which is not personal, if he's committed a crime against the earth, if my land cries out against me and its furrows weep together, if I've eaten the fruit without money, its fruit without money, or caused its owners to lose their lives, then let thistles grow instead of wheat. Thorns and thistles are the punishment for Adam's sin that are brought forth from the earth, because the earth is put under a curse, not Adam. So it brings forth thorns and thistles. He says, then let thistles grow instead of wheat, and weeds instead of barley. Instead of that which sustains life, that is wheat and barley, let thistles and weeds, which have no power to sustain life, let them grow up. And that's his final statement. So Job, it says, the words of Job are ended. He's made his final plea. He's received no compassion from his so-called friends. And now we have the intervention of Elihu, the young man, who will rattle on and on and on, and it sounds so wise, but when God rebukes his friends, he doesn't even mention Elihu. He's not worthy of any kind of mention, but I'm sure he would be covered in the sacrifices that Job was instructed to offer for his friends. So there's so much in this that's instructive. The ultimate rebuke is to be rebuked by Elihu, this young man. Then we are assuming that his friends are older and known for their wisdom and their uprightness. But Elihu jumps in and just rattles on and on and on. It's a final humiliation for Job until finally God does intervene, and that will be the next chapters that we will look at as we conclude this amazing book.
Thank you for listening to the Dr. Warren Gage podcast. If you enjoyed this message, please be sure to like and subscribe to one of our channels so that you never miss an episode. We'd appreciate it if you could also leave us a review. You can find us on drwarrengage.com, YouTube, Apple Podcasts, and Spotify. To support the podcast and gain access to exclusive offers and content from Dr. Warren Gage, please visit our Patreon account at patreon.com/Dr. Warren Gage. We hope you join us next time on the Dr. Warren Gage podcast.